The night tore open with a scream so sharp it felt like glass slicing air, and Mason jolted awake, his chest tight as if unseen hands pressed him down. Mason whispered, "Not again," trembling in the stale silence of his bedroom. The clock ticked past 3:03 a.m., the red glow painting shadows across peeling wallpaper. The air thickened with dread, and the faint rustle in the corner clawed at his nerves. Mason's breath stuttered as a shape detached from the dark, not moving yet watching, its presence colder than the night. The narrator explained that Mason had tried so hard to outrun the past, but the past had always been faster. The scream was gone, but the silence left behind was worse. Mason thought of escape, yet the terror told him that the thing outside his reach had crossed into his room. He was not alone, and he knew it. The narrator revealed that the morning did not cleanse the terror, for daylight only disguised it. Mason sat hunched at his kitchen table, his coffee untouched, staring into the liquid as if it might hold answers. The silence of the house pressed heavy, each creak in the walls twisting his nerves tighter. Mason muttered, "It follows me, doesn't it?" His reflection in the window wavered, fractured by streaks of condensation. He had moved across 3 states in the last year, yet every dawn delivered the same suffocating dread. Even as sunlight cut through blinds, shadows seemed thicker, curling in corners like smoke, unwilling to disperse. His heart hammered at every passing car outside, believing it carried judgment or something worse. The narrator explained that Mason's fight had become routine, surviving nights only to dread the days that mocked him with fragile calm. The narrator told of Mason's desperate drive through unfamiliar backroads later that afternoon, as if speed could outrun the shadow's grip. His knuckles whitened around the steering wheel, veins bulging as the car rattled over cracked asphalt. Wind battered against the windows, a howl that seemed to whisper in voices only he could hear. Mason muttered, "No more running, but where else can I go?" The dashboard clock ticked forward, yet time felt slower, stretched by dread. Each passing tree outside elongated like grasping arms, their shadows flickering against his face. His eyes darted to the rearview mirror, where for a heartbeat the back seat looked occupied, though he dared not check twice. The narrator explained that fear was not behind him, it was inside the car, patient and silent. That evening, Mason pulled into a dimly lit motel on the highway edge, the kind that smelled of old smoke and stale fear. The neon sign flickered, buzzing like an insect trapped in glass. Mason muttered, "Just one night," convincing himself lies were safety. Inside, the walls bore stains of forgotten travelers, and the bed sagged like a tired body. The narrator explained that Mason avoided the mirror, afraid of what might stare back. Every sound became too loud. The hum of the air conditioner, the drip of the sink, the shuffle of unseen feet outside. He locked the door twice, but no lock held against memories that crawled under skin. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the walls, shifting when he blinked. Mason whispered, "Not here too," though he knew the truth. The shadow was patient, and patience was the cruelest weapon. The narrator described midnight in the motel as suffocating, air-heavy with the scent of mold and dust. Mason lay restless, eyes fixed on the ceiling where cracks formed shapes too deliberate to be chance. He heard the hum of electricity falter, lights dimming as if drained by something unseen. Mason's chest rose shallow, the silence punctured by 3 distinct knocks on the wall, rhythmic and deliberate. He whispered, "No one's next door." Sweat drenched his temples, and he dared not move, pinned by fear. The air conditioner rattled, then stopped, leaving a vacuum of silence. In that void, Mason felt a weight press against his chest, not physical but suffocating, forcing shallow breaths. The narrator said the first act of terror was complete. Mason had learned that walls, doors, and miles could not save him, for the shadow had crossed with him yet again. The narrator explained that Mason tried to rebuild life in a small town where strangers did not ask questions. Morning light spilled across quiet streets, but even calm places had shadows. Mason walked into the diner on Main Street, the bell above the door ringing a hollow note. He sat at a corner booth, his eyes scanning windows as though expecting the dark to slip inside. A waitress smiled, yet Mason's shoulders stayed rigid, hands tight around a chipped menu. He whispered, "It won't stop, no matter where I go." Across the room, another man studied him, sharp eyes filled with wary curiosity. This was Daniel, the neighbor Mason had barely met, known for his stubborn disbelief in ghosts. The narrator told how even before they spoke, the air between them carried friction. Mason sought validation, but Daniel's presence promised conflict instead. The narrator described how Daniel approached Mason with casual strides, coffee mug in hand, curiosity masked behind skepticism. He said, "You look like a man hunted by ghosts, but trust me, it's just nerves." Mason's jaw tightened, his eyes flicking to shadows dancing across the diner floor. He muttered, "I've seen it too many times to doubt." Daniel shook his head, laughing under his breath, though unease flickered in his eyes. The room buzzed faintly with chatter, but for Mason every sound collapsed into silence between words. The narrator explained that their exchange planted tension, Mason desperate for belief, Daniel clinging to logic. Outside the diner window, a passing truck cast elongated shadows that slithered unnaturally across the wall. Mason's gaze followed them, pulse quickening, while Daniel dismissed the movement as tricks of light. Later that afternoon, Mason walked home along the quiet street, his mind replaying Daniel's dismissive tone. The narrator said the houses looked ordinary, but their windows stared back like hollow eyes. Mason muttered, "You don't understand. It doesn't care if you believe." A cold wind swept dust along the sidewalk, carrying whispers only he heard. Mason turned sharply, convinced footsteps trailed him, yet no one stood behind. Across the road, Daniel leaned against a fence, arms crossed, shaking his head. Daniel called out, "You'll wear yourself out chasing shadows." Mason ignored him, his stare locked on the shape forming in the reflection of a window, darker than glass should allow. The narrator revealed that the shadow now grew bolder, daring Mason to acknowledge it, even in daylight. The narrator explained that night descended with restless silence. Mason sat in his new living room, blinds drawn, lamp flickering with weak yellow glow. He gripped a half-empty glass, knuckles pale, breath shallow. The silence broke when Daniel knocked at the door, his voice steady but impatient. Daniel said, "You're letting fear rule you, Mason. There's no monster here." Mason opened the door reluctantly, face pale, eyes bloodshot from sleeplessness. He muttered, "Then tell me why it follows me everywhere." Daniel stepped inside, gaze sweeping the cluttered space, unimpressed. Shadows pooled thicker near the corners, moving like liquid unseen. The narrator revealed that Daniel's logic blinded him, but even he felt the sudden drop in temperature, a chill crawling down his spine, though he refused to admit it. The narrator told how Mason tried to sleep, but found no rest. In the dead of night, he lay awake, eyes fixed on ceiling cracks that twisted like veins. The air grew denser, pressing against his chest. From the corner came faint movement, the shadow bending closer, silent but certain. Mason whispered, "You won't leave me, will you?" His voice broke, fragile as glass. Across town, Daniel slept peacefully, mind free of haunting, his rational world intact. Yet in Mason's room, the darkness pulsed, breathing in rhythm with his fear. The narrator said that Act 2 closed with the truth clear. Mason was never escaping. Skepticism and logic did not stop shadows, and while Daniel dismissed him, Mason knew the horror had already claimed its place. The narrator said, Mason woke drenched in sweat, the room cold, though the heater still hummed. He sat upright, clutching his chest, eyes darting to the corner where the dark shifted like water. Mason whispered, "I can't breathe when you're here." The shadow pulsed in rhythm with his words, closer than the night before. Mason stumbled to the mirror, his reflection fractured into three, each face pale and hollow-eyed. He pressed his palm against glass, trembling, and a handprint appeared opposite his, not his own. The narrator explained that this was no hallucination, for the prints dripped as if left by something wet. Mason recoiled, heart racing, as the truth clawed deeper. The shadow was no longer content to watch. It touched, it marked, and it warned that it belonged here. The narrator described Daniel, arriving later that morning, knocking at Mason's door with restless impatience. Mason opened with sunken eyes, lips trembling. He muttered, "It touched me last night." Daniel scoffed, saying, "You are sleep-deprived, Mason. Nothing touched you." Yet his gaze caught the mirror inside, streaked with fresh handprints darker than dust. Daniel frowned, jaw tight, and looked away quickly. Mason demanded, "Tell me that's normal." Silence stretched, heavy with things unspoken. Daniel said nothing, only shifting uncomfortably, his rational walls beginning to crack. The narrator told how disbelief clashed with evidence, creating a tension that neither could name aloud. Mason's desperation grew sharper, and Daniel's skepticism began to bleed into fear he dared not voice. That night, Mason heard soft weeping from the hall, a sound that did not belong. He followed slowly, heart pounding, bare feet dragging across warped floorboards. At the end of the hall stood a figure of a young woman, her back to him, shoulders trembling. Mason whispered, "Who are you?" She turned slowly, her face pale, lips cracked, eyes hollowed with grief. This was Lily, a victim long gone, her presence tethered to the shadow that consumed her. The narrator explained that Lily's voice quivered, "It will take you too." Mason reached out, but her body flickered like a candle's flame, dissolving into the dark. His breath caught in his throat as he realized the shadow did not only follow, it collected, and Lily was proof of what became of those who were chosen. The narrator explained that Mason staggered back into the living room, trembling, muttering, "She spoke to me." Daniel, who had stayed late, raised a brow, irritation masking unease. He said, "You're chasing ghosts, Mason. This is grief, not reality." Mason snapped. "Her name was Lily. She said it will take me." Daniel froze, startled at the detail, then forced a scoff to hide his doubt. The room darkened suddenly as the lamp sputtered, plunging them into semi-darkness. A cold draft swept through closed windows, stirring papers across the table. Mason's voice shook as he said, "You feel that, don't you?" Daniel swallowed hard, refusing to admit the chill crawling across his neck. The narrator told how shadows lengthened, circling them both, and silence pressed down like a predator stalking prey. The narrator said, Mason fell asleep against his will in the early hours, exhaustion breaking his defenses. He woke with a weight across his chest, his breath shallow, his arms pinned. He opened his eyes to see Lily crouched above him, her face inches away, tears dripping onto his skin. She whispered, "It already owns you." Mason thrashed, but her body dissolved into black smoke that poured into his mouth, choking him. His scream strangled into silence as the shadows seeped deeper. He bolted upright, gasping, drenched in sweat, alone in his bed. The narrator explained that Act 3 ended with Mason's truth undeniable. The shadow was not just following, it was inside him now, carving space where hope had no place to hide. The narrator revealed that Mason wandered into the library after another sleepless night, hoping silence might anchor his trembling thoughts. Dust hung in beams of pale morning light, pages whispering as though alive. At a back table sat a woman with sharp eyes and calm posture, watching him with unsettling patience. Mason muttered, "Do I know you?" She replied softly, "Not yet, but I know what follows you." Her name was Evelyn, a figure who carried secrets with the weight of stone. Daniel lingered nearby, arms crossed, clearly irritated but curious. Mason leaned closer, whispering, "Tell me what it is." Evelyn's lips curved faintly, her voice calm. "A shadow older than you, bound by blood." The narrator said that in this first meeting, truth became heavier than silence, and Mason realized his torment was not random at all. The narrator said Evelyn leaned closer, her voice low enough to tremble against silence. She whispered, "It does not follow you by chance. It is tied to your family, to every name before yours." Mason's throat tightened as he muttered, "You mean it wants me because of them?" Evelyn nodded slowly, her eyes unreadable. Daniel scoffed, his voice sharp, "Don't feed him riddles. He's paranoid enough already. Evelyn's gaze turned to Daniel with steel. You don't have to believe. It will not wait for your permission. Mason gripped the table edge, his knuckles pale, sweat dotting his brow. The narrator explained that knowledge cut deeper than denial. For Mason, Evelyn's calm certainty pierced where Daniel's rational words had failed. In that moment, the shadow seemed to breathe louder, as though it relished the truth now spoken aloud. The narrator described how Evelyn produced an old leather-bound book, its spine cracked, symbols etched deep across the cover. She slid it across the table to Mason, saying, "This is where it began." Mason opened trembling pages filled with names, dates, and drawings of a figure, blacker than ink. He muttered, "My family is written here." Evelyn nodded. Everyone touched by the shadow left a mark. Daniel leaned over Mason's shoulder, shaking his head. "This is just superstition." Yet his voice faltered when he saw Mason's surname carved in faded ink. Mason's breath caught and he whispered, "It has always been with me." The narrator told how the book's pages smelled of damp earth, carrying a weight of centuries. As Mason traced the names, the lights above flickered, shadows stretching longer as if awakened. The narrator said, Evelyn's tone sharpened, "The shadow feeds on what you fear most. It will consume you unless you face it." Mason whispered, "I've faced it every night, and it only grows." Evelyn leaned forward, not in fear, in truth. Daniel laughed harshly. "Truth doesn't fight nightmares." Evelyn replied coldly, "Then you will die blind." Mason rubbed his temples, overwhelmed, muttering, "Why me?" Evelyn's voice softened, "Because blood carries weight, and yours is already marked." The narrator explained that Daniel's frustration cracked as unease gnawed deeper, while Mason's despair grew heavier. Shadows in the corners thickened, bending unnaturally with each flicker of the library's lamps. The air chilled, and Evelyn whispered, "It hears us even now." Mason froze, realizing the shadow did not just follow. It listened, feeding on every confession. The narrator described how Evelyn gathered her things and stood, her eyes shadowed but steady. She said, "You have only begun to understand. Tonight, it will test you harder." Mason whispered, "How do I stop it?" Evelyn's answer was a whisper laced with warning. "You cannot stop what you are bound to. You can only decide how long you resist." Daniel muttered, "She's filling your head with poison," but his voice lacked its earlier strength. Mason reached out, desperate, but Evelyn stepped back, her coat brushing the floor as she left. The narrator explained that silence swallowed the space once she was gone, and Mason felt emptier than before. He realized that knowledge was no shield, only another weight. In the corner, the shadow thickened like ink poured into water, swelling, pleased by every word spoken in its name. The narrator explained that Mason sat alone in his room, the leather-bound book Evelyn had left open before him. His eyes traced the inked names until he found one he recognized, his mother's. He whispered, "She knew." Memories fractured, his mother's fearful glances, her whispered prayers at night, her insistence on moving every year. Mason slammed the book shut, trembling, shouting, "Why didn't she tell me?" The lights flickered violently, shadows spiraling across the walls. A voice rose from the corner, deep and hollow, whispering, "Because she could not escape me." Mason froze, breath shallow, his worst fear confirmed. The narrator revealed that denial was gone, replaced by rage. Mason realized he had not inherited only blood, but also the curse itself, and the shadow had always been his birthright. The narrator said Daniel arrived after hearing Mason's shouting, stepping into the dimly lit room with hesitation. Mason turned, eyes red, face pale, muttering, "It was her. My mother knew." Daniel frowned. "You're unraveling, Mason." Mason shouted, "Look at the names," forcing the book into Daniel's hands. Daniel scanned pages, his voice breaking. This is your family." Mason's breathing grew ragged as shadows pulsed across the ceiling. Daniel muttered, "Maybe she tried to protect you." Mason slammed his fist on the desk, voice cracking. "She lied to me." The narrator explained that Daniel's skepticism collapsed under the weight of evidence. For the first time, Daniel whispered, "Maybe it's real." And in that whisper, the shadow grew stronger, feeding on the crack in logic. The narrator described how Mason stormed outside into the night air, the book clutched to his chest. The street was empty, bathed in sickly orange glow from a single flickering lamp. He shouted into the silence, "What do you want from me?" The wind surged, carrying whispers that tangled into his name. Behind him, Lily appeared, her ghostly body swaying, her voice trembling. "It wanted me too." Mason turned sharply, eyes wet, whispering, "Why me?" Lily's hollow gaze met his. "Because you are not hunted, you are chosen." The narrator revealed the twist like a blade. Mason was not merely prey, but tethered to the shadow by inheritance. Lily's form dissolved into smoke, leaving Mason kneeling in the road, screaming into the void. The truth left him more broken than the lies ever had. The narrator said Daniel ran after Mason, grabbing his shoulder, shouting, "Stop, you're losing it." Mason shoved him back, eyes blazing with fury. "I'm not losing it, I'm already lost," he cried. Daniel's voice cracked. "You don't have to give in." Mason whispered, "I was never given a choice." Shadows surged along the road, wrapping around Mason's legs like chains. Daniel tried pulling him free, his hands shaking, but Mason screamed, "It wants me." The narrator explained that betrayal hung heavy, though it came not from Daniel or Evelyn, but from family blood itself. Mason's voice broke into sobs as the chains of shadow tightened, dragging across the asphalt like iron. Daniel's strength faltered, his disbelief shattered, but helplessness made him weak against what no man could fight. The narrator revealed the final horror of Act 5. Mason collapsed against the pavement, whispering through tears, "It's inside me." Daniel shook him, desperate, saying, "Fight it, Mason." But Mason's eyes turned black for a moment, his voice layered with something deeper, whispering, "I am it." Daniel stumbled back, horrified. The shadows shrank briefly, then surged larger than ever, blanketing the street in suffocating dark. Mason gasped, clutching his chest, his body convulsing as the night swallowed his form. The narrator explained that the twist had come. Mason was never just a victim. He was the vessel, a bloodline's final curse, the shadow's chosen body. As silence reclaimed the night, Daniel stood frozen, his rational world dead, and the real nightmare only beginning. The narrator said Mason awoke on the cold asphalt, his body trembling as though struck by lightning. Daniel hovered nearby, face pale, muttering, "You're scaring the hell out of me." Mason whispered, "It's not me anymore." His chest heaved, words spilling like confession. The street around them darkened, every lamp flickering until only shadow remained. Mason clutched his head, screaming, "Get out of me!" But the voice that answered came from his own throat, deeper and layered. "I have always been here." Daniel stumbled back, eyes wide, whispering, "Oh God." The narrator explained that Mason was both victim and vessel now, the struggle no longer external but carved into his veins. In that moment, the air thickened, the fight between man and shadow finally erupting where neither could hide. The narrator revealed that Evelyn emerged from the darkness, her coat sweeping the pavement, her voice steady but urgent. "You must fight, Mason, or it will take root forever." Mason's body convulsed, his eyes flashing black, his voice layered. It already had. Evelyn raised a hand, pulling from her bag a small iron talisman, etched with symbols from the book. Daniel shouted, "What the hell is that?" Evelyn replied, "The only thing it fears is truth bound in iron." She pressed the talisman into Mason's palm, but his hand shook violently, rejecting it. Mason screamed, "It burns!" The narrator explained that the shadow recoiled, the air snapping with static. Evelyn's eyes narrowed, whispering, "Then it can still be fought." For the first time, the shadow flinched, revealing weakness in its endless hunger. The narrator said, Mason collapsed to his knees, the talisman searing against his palm, as if rejecting his very blood. He gasped. It won't let go. Evelyn urged. You must claim it, Mason, not resist it. Daniel shouted. He's dying. But Evelyn's focus stayed sharp, her voice cutting like steel. He is choosing. Mason's body convulsed, his face pale, veins blackening under his skin. His voice shifted, two tones entwined, one begging, one mocking. I am not yours, Mason whispered, though his lips curled with the shadow's smirk. The narrator explained that the battle had turned inward, Mason clawing for his humanity while the shadow dug deeper. The street pulsed with flickering lights, reality itself bending under the clash of will and darkness. The narrator described how shadows surged upward, towering above them like a storm given form. A monstrous figure loomed, its outline shifting, its face a void of endless hunger. Mason looked up, sweat pouring, muttering, "That's what I become." Daniel grabbed his arm, pleading, "Don't let it take you." Evelyn raised her voice, sharp as a blade. "Confront it, claim what it cannot own." The shadow's voice rumbled. "He is already mine." Mason screamed, pressing the talisman to his chest, the heat searing through fabric. The narrator said light burst, cracking the night open, shadows writhing in agony. Mason's cry mixed with the shadow's roar, a single sound of unbearable struggle, as man and curse clashed in their final violent confrontation. The narrator said Mason fell back onto the ground, his body trembling, smoke rising from his chest where the talisman seared through fabric. His voice wavered, "I can't hold it." Evelyn crouched close, whispering, "Then let it see your truth." Mason's eyes flickered between black and human, his breath ragged. He shouted, "I am not you!" The shadow shrieked, its form unraveling like torn cloth in the wind. Daniel pulled Mason upward, screaming, "Stay with me." The narrator explained that the climax reached its breaking point. Mason had pushed the shadow back, but victory came with scars carved into flesh and soul. As silence fell, the night no longer safe, Mason realized he had not destroyed the shadow. He had only forced it deeper inside, waiting. The narrator said, "Dawn arrived gray and heavy, its light offering no comfort." Mason sat slumped against Daniel's shoulder, his face pale, eyes distant, the talisman scorched into his hoodie. Daniel whispered, "It's over." Mason's lips cracked into a whisper, "No, it's waiting." Evelyn stood nearby, her expression unreadable, saying softly, "He is right. Evil this old does not die. It lingers." Mason looked toward the horizon, eyes hollow, muttering, "Then I'll never be free." The narrator explained that, even with shadows fading, silence carried unease. Mason's body shook with exhaustion, yet his soul carried weight heavier than his frame. The truth was unshakable. Victory was only survival, not release, and the curse would never truly loosen its hold. The narrator revealed Mason was taken back to his house, though it no longer felt like home. Inside, he sat hunched on the couch, staring at his hands as if searching for proof of humanity. Daniel muttered, "We'll figure this out," his voice uncertain. Evelyn stood at the window, watching shadows shift beneath the trees, whispering, "You will not have long." Mason asked quietly, "What happens when it comes again?" Evelyn turned, her gaze cold. "You fight or you surrender." Daniel said sharply, "There has to be another way." Evelyn shook her head, her silence an answer louder than words. The narrator explained that Mason felt trapped, not by walls, but by blood and fate, knowing the horror was already inside his skin. The narrator said night fell quickly, as though the sun feared lingering. Mason sat in bed, the talisman on his nightstand, glowing faintly in the dark. Daniel paced the hallway, unable to rest, muttering to himself, "It's not real. It can't be real." Evelyn's voice drifted from the corner, calm yet sharp. "Belief will not save you, Daniel, only endurance." Mason whispered, "I hear it breathing." Silence pressed heavy, then the window rattled, though no wind blew. Mason clutched the talisman, sweat dripping down his face. The narrator explained that this was no peace, only pause, and the shadow's hunger returned quickly. Every second stretched like a blade, and Mason knew the nightmare had not ended. It had only changed shape. The narrator explained that Mason dreamed of a field stretching endless under a black sky. In the distance, dozens of figures stood, hollow-eyed, pale, their bodies fading into shadow. At the front was Lily, her voice faint. "We are what comes after you." Mason reached for her, shouting, "No!" But his hands passed through air. The shadow rose behind her, towering, its voice inside his mind. "You are already one of us." Mason screamed until his throat burned, but no sound carried. He awoke in bed, gasping, the talisman searing hot against his palm, though he had not touched it. The narrator said dreams were no refuge, only another cage where the curse tightened its hold. Mason realized he was marked in every world, waking or not. The narrator revealed the final moment of Mason's torment. He sat at the kitchen table just before dawn, exhausted eyes fixed on the talisman lying before him. Daniel dozed in a chair nearby, head tilted, his skepticism long broken. Evelyn stood silent, arms folded, gaze heavy. Mason whispered to himself, "Maybe it ends if I end." His fingers brushed the talisman, heat rising, shadows curling beneath his skin. The refrigerator hummed, then stopped, leaving silence sharp as a blade. From the corner came a faint whisper, Mason's own voice repeating, "I am it." His face crumpled, a tear slipping down. The narrator said the horror left no comfort, only the truth. Mason had survived the night, but the shadow had not left. It was only waiting for him to stop resisting.